The rhythmic crunch of his boots on the gravel was the only sound Arthur Pringle allowed himself to acknowledge. It was a familiar sound, as comforting and as predictable as the rising sun. Left, right, 20 paces forward. A sharp turn, 20 paces back. Repeat, hour after hour, day after day. This was the life of a household cavalryman, a Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace, and Arthur wouldn't have it any other way. He stood sentinel at one of the most famous landmarks in the world. A silent, unmoving figure in a scarlet tunic and a towering bearskin hat that felt like it weighed a small elephant. The uniform was iconic, recognized instantly across the globe. But what the tourists, with their clicking cameras and whispered awe, didn't see was the man inside. Arthur Pringle was 24 years old, and he had wanted to be a guard since he was a boy, tracing the figures in his grandfather's old picture books. His grandfather, a proud veteran, had instilled in him a deep sense of duty and respect for tradition. Arthur had absorbed all the stories of bravery and unwavering loyalty like a sponge. When he finally donned the uniform, the weight of the bearskin felt less like a burden and more like a crown, a symbol of the immense trust placed upon him. His post today was near the main gate, a prime spot for curious onlookers. They pressed against the railings, craning their necks, hoping for a glimpse of royalty, or at the very least, a twitch from the famously unmoving guards. Arthur had mastered the art of stillness. His muscles might ache, his eyes might sting from the wind, but his face remained a mask of stoic dedication. He was not Arthur Pringle, a lad from Kent, who secretly enjoyed a good rock and roll tune and dreamt of one day owning a little cottage with a garden. He was a pillar of the British monarchy, an extension of the very bricks and mortar of the palace itself. Inside his head, though, was a different story. His thoughts, like mischievous little mice, scurried around, sometimes darting to the roast beef his mum was probably making for Sunday dinner, sometimes to the lady or woman who had tried to offer him a daisy. Yesterday he had ignored the daisy, of course. Protocol demanded it. No interaction, no speaking, no emotion. He was a statue, alive but inanimate. Pringle. A low voice rumbled from beside him, breaking his internal monologue. It was Sergeant Miller, a grizzled veteran, whose uniform seemed to carry the weight of decades of duty. Miller's eyes, though sharp, held a hint of amusement. "You look like you're contemplating the meaning of the universe." Arthur, without altering his posture by a millimeter, simply offered a barely perceptible flicker of his eyes towards the sergeant, a silent acknowledgement. Miller chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "Good man, Miller," said, patting his arm. "Just checking in another 15 minutes and you're off. Then it's back to barracks for a well-deserved brew." He paused, lowering his voice conspirately. Hurd remained outwardly impassive. Arthur remained outwardly impassive. Inside, however, a tiny spark of curiosity ignited. He had caught snippets of conversation in the mess hall, hushed whispers about a high-profile American coming to London. Not royalty, not a politician, someone else, someone bigger. Miller, seeing Arthur's unwavering silence, seemed to take it as an invitation to elaborate. "Seems like the whole city's abuzz. The Yanks are sending over their biggest star. Apparently he's quite the phenomenon." He leaned in closer, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of London traffic. "Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. They're calling him." The name resonated even within Arthur's carefully constructed fortress of discipline. Elvis Presley? Even in the disciplined, slightly old-fashioned world of the Guards, the name had seeped in. Records played on forbidden radios during quiet hours. Articles glimpsed in newspapers. The sheer, undeniable energy of the man. Arthur, despite himself, had a faint, almost subconscious awareness of the music, the charisma, the sheer, undeniable force of nature. That was Elvis. "He's supposedly planning to take London by storm," Miller continued, straightening up. "Big concerts, public appearances, the works. Even a rumor. He might try to catch a glimpse of the palace, Can you imagine him here among all this tradition? Miller gestured broadly at the stately facade of Buckingham Palace. There was a note of skepticism in his voice, a hint of the old guard's quiet disapproval of anything too loud or too new. Arthur, for his part, felt a strange, unfamiliar flutter in his chest. It was an excitement, not exactly, more like a ripple in the perfectly still pond of his existence. Elvis Presley, here in London, a man who embodied everything that was loud, new, and unconventional. And Arthur Pringle, the very embodiment of tradition and quiet discipline, would be here too, standing guard. Right then, Pringle, keep your chin up and don't let anyone try to give you another daisy, Miller said, with a final grin, before marching off to check on the next sentry. Arthur continued his measured paces, left, right, the gravel crunched, the bearskin felt heavy. But now, amidst the familiar sounds and sensations, there was a new undercurrent, a faint, almost imperceptible hum of anticipation. London was about to host the king of rock and roll, and Arthur Pringle, the Queen's Guard, would be waiting. He just didn't know yet how profoundly that visit would change his perfectly ordered world. The news of Elvis Presley's impending arrival in London spread like wildfire, even through the thick stone walls of the Buckingham Palace barracks. It wasn't just a rumor anymore, it was official. The newspapers blared headlines, the radio played his latest hits on repeat, and the general public seemed to collectively hold its breath. London was preparing for a seismic event, and Arthur, despite his rigorous schedule and enforced isolation, couldn't escape the mounting excitement. During his off-duty hours, the mess hall buzzed with chatter. Other guards, usually reserved and focused on their duties, found themselves discussing the American phenomenon. Heard he's got a whole entourage with him, like a small army. One young private barely out of training, exclaimed, his eyes wide. Bodyguards, managers, the works. And the girls, another chimed in. A more seasoned guardsman named George, who often shared a quiet pint with Arthur. They say they faint when he so much as winks at them. Imagine the chaos if he comes near the palace. George shot Arthur a knowing look. You'd have your work cut out for you, Pringle. Arthur merely grunted, stirring his tea. He tried to maintain his usual detached demeanor, but even he felt the pull of the general curiosity. He wasn't a devotee of rock and roll, preferring the more traditional sounds of military bands or classical music. Yet there was something undeniably captivating about Elvis Presley. His face was everywhere on magazine covers, in shop windows, even on promotional posters, plastered illicitly on lampposts. He exuded an almost mythical aura. Later that week, while strolling through St. James Park on a rare afternoon, Arthur saw the evidence of the city's fever firsthand. Groups of young women, their hair styled high, their skirts swinging, talked excitedly about concert tickets and fan club meetings. They held up copies of music magazines with Elvis's smoldering gaze staring out from the cover. Even the usually unflappable Londoners seemed caught up in the frenzy. Arthur, in his civilian clothes, a simple tweed jacket and trousers, blended into the crowd, observing. He noticed an elderly couple sharing a newspaper, the man shaking his head at the headlines about Elvis's extravagant demands, the woman giggling as she read about his famous hip swivel. It wasn't just the youth. Elvis had seemingly captured the imagination of everyone. Back at the barracks, the senior officers maintained a calm, almost dismissive attitude towards the coming spectacle. Maintain professionalism, gentlemen, Captain Davies, their commanding officer, had stated during a morning briefing, his voice crisp and authoritative. Regardless of who visits our capital, our duty remains paramount. There will be no undue fraternization, no breaches of protocol. The dignity of the palace and the crown must be upheld at all times. This was drilled into them. Daily protocol dictated every movement, every gesture, every single interaction, or lack thereof. For a guard breaking protocol was akin to treason, an unthinkable act. Arthur had internalized this more than anyone. He was a stickler for the rules, believing deeply in the order and respect they represented. Yet despite all the training and all the discipline, Arthur found himself increasingly intrigued. He knew little about Elvis beyond the headlines and the music snippets. Was he truly charismatic in person? Did he truly possess that magnetic pull? Arthur pictured himself on duty, rigid and unmoving, while the circus of Elvis's fame swirled around him. It would be a true test of his self-control. One evening, George found Arthur in the quiet corner of the library poring over a book on military history. George slid into the seat opposite him, a folded newspaper in his hand. "Still reading about dusty old battles, Pringle?" George teased gently. "Should be catching up on the king of rock and roll. He's due to land at Heathrow next Tuesday. Can you believe it? The whole world's watching." Arthur closed his book, placing it carefully on the table. "Duty calls for attention, George, not celebrity. Gossip? Oh, come off it, Arthur. Even you must feel a little something. He's bigger than the Beatles, bigger than anyone we've seen in years." He unfolded the newspaper. The front page was dominated by a huge photograph of Elvis mid-performance microphone. In hand, a dazzling smile on his face. Look at him, the confidence, the showmanship. It's infectious. Arthur glanced at the photo. He had to admit the man possessed an undeniable presence. Even in the still image, his eyes seemed to twinkle with a mischievous energy. "They say he's got a soft spot for the military too," George added, pointing to a small article beside the main story. "Did his service in Germany, apparently. Private Presley, they called him. Then just like us, really." That detail resonated with Arthur, a shared experience. The discipline, the camaraderie, the uniform. Suddenly, Elvis Presley wasn't just a distant, flashy celebrity. He was a fellow serviceman, albeit one who had gone on to achieve unimaginable fame. As the days counted down to Elvis's arrival, the atmosphere in London crackled. Arthur felt it even on his patrols. The air seemed charged with anticipation. The crowds outside the palace seemed thicker, more expectant. Everyone was waiting for the king. And Arthur Pringle, the unmoving guardian of tradition, found himself waiting too, a quiet observer on the cusp of an encounter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, fame, and the unexpected connections that bind humanity. He just had to be ready for whatever whirlwind Elvis brought to their very disciplined doorstep. The day Elvis Presley landed in London was a whirlwind of noise and excitement. Arthur, standing watch at the palace gates, could practically feel the vibrations of the city's roar, even from his secluded post. News reports, shouted by vendors and blared from radios, spoke of thousands of screaming fans at Heathrow Airport, of traffic jams stretching for miles. All for one man. The king had truly arrived. He imagined the scene. Flashing lights, frenzied crowds, the sheer undeniable force of Elvis's presence. It was a stark contrast to the quiet, disciplined world Arthur inhabited. He was a bastion of order, a living monument to timeless tradition. Elvis was a storm, a hurricane of modern energy and raw charisma. Later that evening, off-duty, Arthur found himself in the common room, where a crackly radio broadcast played a live report from a London hotel where Elvis was rumored to be staying. The reporter's voice was breathless, describing a scene of utter pandemonium. "Crowds are simply unbelievable, folks. They're swarming the streets, hoping for just a glimpse of the king." He waved from his balcony just moments ago, and the roar was deafening. Arthur listened, a strange mix of fascination and mild apprehension stirring within him. He considered the sheer weight of that kind of fame, the constant scrutiny, the endless demands. It sounded exhausting, almost suffocating. Preferred his quiet routine, the predictable rhythm of his duty. Yet he couldn't deny the unique magnetism Elvis possessed, a power to move and excite millions. Over the next few days, Elvis's presence dominated the city. His concerts were sellouts, reports detailing how he had mesmerized audiences, his voice and movements captivating all who witnessed them. Photos plastered across newspapers showed him in various London locales, posing with fans, visiting famous landmarks, even reportedly trying a pint in a traditional pub. He was everywhere, an omnipresent force, One afternoon, during a shift change, Arthur overheard Captain Davies speaking with Sergeant Miller, their voices low and serious. "Security is being tightened," Captain Davies said, his brow furrowed. "The Americans' movements are attracting unpresent crowds. We've received intelligence that some overzealous fans might try to get too close to the palace, hoping to see him drive by. Or even worse, attempt to gain." "Understood, sir. We'll be extra vigilant. If he does choose to pay his respects to the crown, even from a distance, we must ensure absolute control, no breaches, no incidents. The reputation of the household division rests on it." Arthur, hearing this, felt a prickle of unease. The thought of Elvis, a whirlwind of celebrity potentially nearing his quiet, disciplined post, was both thrilling and terrifying. How would he maintain his composure if faced with such a powerful presence? Especially if crowds became unruly. His training kicked in, reminding him of every drill, every protocol, every lesson in maintaining a stone-faced exterior. That night, Arthur found it harder to sleep than usual. Kept imagining scenarios. Elvis's car driving past, the quick flash of a smile, the roar of the crowds. Would he even notice a solitary, unmoving guard among the throng? Probably not. He was just a small, anonymous cog in the grand machinery of the palace. He dreamt strangely of music, not the disciplined marches he was accustomed to, but a different kind of rhythm, electrifying and wild, accompanied by a voice that resonated deep within him. He woke with a start, the lingering echo of a guitar riff in his mind. The next morning, the air outside the palace was thick with anticipation. The usual gaggle of tourists was significantly larger, their numbers bolstered by dedicated Elvis fans clutching cameras and autograph books. They knew he was in London, and they were hopeful he might make an appearance near the royal residence. Arthur took his post, the bearskin feeling heavier than usual, the scarlet tunic a beacon against the gray London sky. He focused on his breathing, on the precise rhythm of his patrol. Left, right, 20 paces turn, 20 paces. His eyes, though unmoving, scanned the crowd, noting every face, every potential disturbance. Then a ripple went through the crowd. A murmur began, growing louder, turning into a collective gasp, then a shriek of excitement. Arthur's peripheral vision registered a flurry of movement down the mall. A procession of sleek black cars moving slowly, deliberately. His heart gave an involuntary lurch. This was it. The lead car, a Rolls-Royce, glided closer. Through the tinted windows, Arthur could make out a distinctive silhouette, a familiar profile. The famous pompadour, unmistakable. It was Elvis. He was just a few hundred yards away, approaching the palace gates, approaching Arthur's post. Crowds surged, pressing against the railings, their cheers building to a crescendo. Flashbulbs popped like fireflies. Security personnel already in place moved to hold back the most enthusiastic fans. Arthur tightened his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white. Every fiber of his being screamed to remain steadfast, to maintain his unyielding posture. He was a guard. This was his duty. But as the Rolls-Royce drew closer, close enough for him to see the man inside clearly, Arthur felt an unexpected tremor. King of rock and roll in the flesh was about to pass before him. The line between his disciplined world and the chaotic, glittering world of celebrity was about to blur, perhaps irrevocably. He braced himself, ready for the ultimate test of his unwavering resolve. The Rolls-Royce slowed as it approached the main gates of Buckingham Palace. Arthur's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, threatening to betray his outward composure. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded, but his peripheral vision drank in every detail. The crowd was a roaring, surging wave of humanity. Fans pressed against the iron railings, their faces contorted with excitement, their arms outstretched. Could hear their desperate cries, "Elvis! Elvis!" above the din of camera clicks and the distant wail of police sirens. Car, sleek and impossibly elegant, came to a near stop directly in front of Arthur's post. Through the tinted window, now slightly lowered, he caught a clear glimpse. It was him, Elvis Presley. He was wearing a dark suit, his famous pompadour impeccably styled. His face, even through the glass, radiated an almost unearthly charisma. He had a slight smile on his lips, a subtle wave of his hand to the cheering throngs. For a fleeting moment their eyes met, or at least Arthur felt they did. Couldn't be sure if Elvis was truly looking at him, the anonymous guard, or simply at the general spectacle that surrounded him. But in that split second, Arthur felt a strange connection. It wasn't the kind of connection he felt with his fellow guards, born of shared discipline and duty. It was something else, something akin to recognition, a silent acknowledgement across the chasm of their vastly different worlds. Elvis's smile seemed to widen just a fraction, a knowing glint in his eye, as if he understood the immense restraint required of Arthur. Then just as quickly as it had paused, the car began to move again, gliding past the gates, down the mall, and disappearing from view. Crowds, though still buzzing with excitement, slowly began to disperse. The roar lessened, replaced by chatter and the lingering echo of flashbulbs. Arthur remained rooted to his spot, his posture unchanged, his rifle held firm. His mind, however, was reeling. He had seen him, the king, up close, and for a moment, just for a moment, he had felt seen. It was an unusual sensation for Arthur, who was used to being invisible, a backdrop to the grander events of the world. The rest of his shift felt both excruciatingly long and strangely exhilarating. His usual focus on the mundane details of his patrol was now infused with the memory of that encounter. He replayed it in his mind, trying to discern if that eye contact had been real, if that subtle widening of Elvis's smile had been a response to him. It seemed absurd. Why would the king of rock and roll notice a solitary guard? When his relief arrived, Arthur executed the precise movements of the handover, saluted crisply, and marched back to the barracks. He felt a hum of restless energy beneath his usual stoicism. Later in the mess hall, George joined him for supper. "Did you see him, Arthur? The king himself drove right past your post, didn't he?" George's face was alight with excitement. "I heard the roar all the way from the parade ground. Must have been something." Arthur nodded slowly, stirring his stew. "He passed by." "Just passed by." George chuckled. "Come on, Pringle, don't tell me you weren't a little bit impressed. He's got some aura about him, doesn't he?" Arthur considered his response carefully. He seemed composed for the circumstances. It was the closest he would come to admitting any personal impression. George leaned in. "Rumor has it he's fascinated by the palace guards, wants to know how we can stand so still for so long. Someone in his entourage apparently mentioned it to one of our officers." Arthur felt a flicker of surprise. Elvis interested in them. That was an unexpected piece of information. It added another layer to the brief interaction he'd had. Maybe that fleeting eye contact hadn't been his imagination after all. The idea that Elvis, a man of such dynamic movement and expressive performance, would be curious about the very embodiment of stillness was almost comical, but it also sparked a flicker of pride in Arthur. Their discipline, their unique tradition was remarkable enough to capture the attention of a global superstar. Over the next few days, Elvis continued his whirlwind London tour. His concerts were legendary, his public appearances mobbed. Arthur, during his limited off-duty hours, found himself seeking out the news, scanning headlines, subtly trying to gather more information about the man who had briefly crossed his path. He learned of Elvis's generosity, his humble beginnings, his deep respect for his fans. He saw photos of Elvis, looking slightly weary, even lonely, despite the adoration that surrounded him. King of rock and roll wasn't just a performer. He was a human being bearing the immense weight of his fame. One evening, Arthur was alone in the quiet of his bunk, polishing his boots to a mirror shine. His mind drifted back to the moment the Rolls-Royce had paused. The fleeting glimpse of Elvis's face, the slight smile, the seeming acknowledgement. He thought of Captain Davies' stern warnings about maintaining protocol, about upholding the dignity of the crown. Arthur believed in those words deeply. Duty was everything. But what if, he mused, Duty was more than just rigid adherence to rules. What if it was also about the quiet human connections that transcended status and celebrity? The thought was fleeting, almost heretical. He quickly pushed it away. He was a guard, unmoving, unflappable. Yet the seed of a new idea had been planted, a tiny crack in the stoic facade he had so carefully constructed, and it had been planted by the king himself. The London air, usually thick with drizzle, was unexpectedly bright. Elvis Presley was extending his stay for a few extra days, much to the delight of his adoring public. The city still thrummed with his presence, his music seemingly drifting from every open window. His image still splashed across every newspaper. Arthur, back on sentinel duty at the palace gates, found his mind returning to the brief encounter with Elvis's car. He tried to dismiss it as an insignificant moment, one of many thousands of faces he encountered on duty, but it clung to him a persistent echo. The curiosity Elvis reportedly held for the guards, the shared military background George had mentioned, these details had subtly shifted Arthur's perception of the distant superstar. He observed the crowds today. They were still large, but perhaps a little less frenzied, having had their fill of concert madness. Many were simply soaking in the atmosphere, lingering near the palace. Arthur noticed a small group of children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, holding up handmade signs for Elvis. One read simply, W.E. Love Qui O U. Another had a crudely drawn guitar. They looked hopeful, their small faces upturned, waiting for a miracle. Suddenly, a commotion down the mall. Not a car this time, but a small gathering of people, led by what looked like a member of Elvis's entourage, moving towards the palace. They weren't coming to the gates, but seemed to be taking a casual stroll along the perimeter, closer to the public viewing areas. Arthur maintained his rigid stance, but his gaze, fixed straight ahead, registered the figures. And then he saw him. Elvis? He wasn't in a car this time. He was walking, surrounded by a few security personnel, but remarkably, he seemed to be making an effort to interact with the fans. Arthur watched, barely breathing, as Elvis paused, leaning down to speak to a young boy who was holding out a crumpled autograph book. He signed it, flashed his famous smile, and ruffled the boy's hair. The boy's face lit up a pure, unadulterated joy that was almost palpable. Then Elvis's eyes scanned the crowd, and they seemed to drift towards the palace, towards Arthur's post. For a second he paused, his gaze seeming to lock onto the unmoving guard. It wasn't the hurried, fleeting glimpse from the car. This was a deliberate look, one filled with a quiet curiosity. Arthur felt a jolt, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. Elvis then did something unexpected. He lifted a hand, not in his usual flamboyant wave to the masses, but in a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It wasn't directed at Arthur, not overtly. It was a general wave to the public gathered near that section of the palace, but it felt to Arthur as if it contained a silent acknowledgement of the guards, standing sentinel. And in that moment, as Elvis turned and continued his walk, Arthur saw the children's faces, still beaming, still clutching their signs. A thought startling in its clarity sparked in Arthur's mind. These children, they adored Elvis. They saw him as a hero, a source of happiness. And here he was acknowledging them, a simple human gesture that meant the world. Later that day, back in the quiet of his barrack room, Arthur found himself replaying the scene, the image of Elvis signing the boy's autograph book. The way the boy's eyes had shone had gnawed at him. He was a guard sworn to uphold protocol, to be a living symbol of the monarchy. But he was also a human being with a heart that, despite all his training, felt a pang for genuine joy and human connection. He thought of their rigid rules: no talking, no smiling, no acknowledging the public. These rules were essential for maintaining the dignity of his position, for upholding the image of the stoic, unwavering British military. But what if, just once for a fleeting moment, a small deviation could bring immense joy to someone? The idea was dangerous, radical even. It was a direct challenge to everything he had been taught, everything he believed about his duty. Captain Davy's stern voice echoed in his mind. No breaches of protocol. Arthur paced his small room. The iconic photo that would one day be taken hadn't happened yet, but the seeds for it were being planted. He imagined the scene. Himself, unmoving, and Elvis, the king of rock and roll, engaging with the world around him. The contrast was stark. He remembered George's words. "He's got some aura about him." Yes, he did. An aura of connection, of effortless charm that seemed to draw people in. Arthur, in his bearskin and scarlet, was designed to keep people out, to project an image of impregnable authority. But what if, for just a second, those two worlds could touch? What if the rigid protocol could bend just a fraction for a moment of shared humanity? He tried to dismiss the thought. It was foolish. He was a guard. He had a job to do. But the image of the beaming child and the quiet curiosity in Elvis's eyes as he looked at the palace guards lingered. It wasn't about autograph hunting or breaking rules for the sake of it. It was about something deeper. A shared moment, a simple gesture, a connection between people regardless of their station. Arthur knew the consequences of breaking protocol could be severe. Reprimand, suspension, even dismissal. His entire career, his future, depended on his unwavering adherence to the rules. But a tiny rebellious voice in the back of his mind whispered, what if it was worth it? What if one small human moment could create something truly special, something unforgettable? The idea, once a whisper, was now a persistent hum growing louder with each passing hour. The air in London had taken on a crisp autumnal chill, a stark contrast to the lingering heat of Elvis's presence. His extended visit was drawing to a close, and the city was abuzz with his final public appearances. The intensity had peaked, and now there was a quieter, almost melancholic buzz as his departure loomed. Arthur found himself on duty at the main gate again, his senses heightened, his internal debate still raging. The image of Elvis interacting with the children, the pure joy on their faces, had lodged itself firmly in his mind. He couldn't shake it. He thought of the many tourists who came to the palace, hoping for a memory, a story to tell. Most left with just a picture of a stoic guard. What if he could give them, and Elvis, something more? He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was his last chance. Elvis would be leaving soon. If anything was to happen, it had to be now. But how? And more importantly, would he? The internal conflict was agonizing. On one side, decades of tradition, the weight of his uniform, the oath he had sworn, Captain Davy's stern warnings, the very foundation of his disciplined life. On the other, a burgeoning sense of human connection, a quiet admiration for a man who, despite his fame, seemed genuinely interesting, connecting with people. But the rebellious whisper in his heart argued for something else, a flicker of acknowledgement, a shared moment. His shift was long, stretching into the afternoon. Crowd was thinner now, mostly dedicated fans still hoping for a final glimpse, or families with young children on school holiday. Then a distinct buzz went through the remaining crowd. It wasn't the roar of a car or the surge of a major event. It was a more hushed, anticipatory ripple. A group of people were approaching, walking casually from the direction of Birdcage Walk. And in the center of them, unmistakable even from a distance, was Elvis. He was dressed less formally than before, in a simple jacket, his hair still perfect. He wasn't surrounded by a massive security detail. It seemed like a quieter, more personal outing. Arthur's heart gave a leap. This wasn't a planned procession. This was different. This felt spontaneous. As Elvis drew closer, Arthur could see he was smiling, chatting with the people accompanying him. His eyes naturally drifted towards the iconic palace and the figures guarding it. He was coming directly towards Arthur's post. Arthur's palms began to sweat beneath his white gloves, every muscle in his body. He focused on his breathing, trying to calm the frantic drumbeat in his chest. His training, honed over years, screened him to remain a statue. Elvis was now only a few feet away, close enough that Arthur could hear the low murmur of his voice, the slight southern drawl. He saw the genuine warmth in his eyes, the almost boyish curiosity as he looked at Arthur. And then Elvis paused, right in front of Arthur. He wasn't speaking loudly. not performing. He was simply looking at him, a slight, respectful smile playing on his lips. His security detail, seeing the brief pause, subtly moved to create a small buffer, but they didn't intervene. The small crowd that had followed Elvis, realizing the king had stopped, hushed. All eyes were on the two figures, the vibrant, world-famous superstar and the unmoving, disciplined guard. The silence was thick, charged with unspoken expectation. Elvis's gaze held Arthur's, not challengingly, but with a quiet, almost gentle inquiry. It was as if he was asking without words, "How do you do it? How do you stand there so still, so resolute?" In that moment, Arthur made his decision. It was the culmination of days of internal struggle, of the lingering image of the joyous children, of the unexpected respect he felt for this unique man. He knew the risk, he knew the potential consequences. But he also knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his soul, that this was a moment that demanded a human response. He was a guard, yes, but he was also Arthur Pringle, and a king, not of a country, but of a culture, was standing before him, not demanding, but simply acknowledging. Arthur felt a surge of warmth, a quiet defiance, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. He would break protocol. Not for fame, not for attention, but for a shared, fleeting moment of humanity. The iconic photograph hadn't been taken yet, but the stage was set, and Arthur was ready to play his part. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic and the rapid pounding beat of Arthur's own heart. Elvis Presley stood before him, mere feet away, a quiet smile on his face, his eyes full of an almost childlike wonder as he looked at the unmoving guard. The small crowd, sensing the extraordinary nature of the moment, held its collective breath. Arthur remained frozen, his rifle held perfectly, his bearskin hat casting a shadow over his unblinking eyes. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to stay still, to be nothing more than a statue. But the gentle curiosity in Elvis's gaze, the unspoken respect, was a powerful counterforce. Elvis, seeing Arthur's unwavering posture, slowly extended his right hand. It was a simple, polite gesture, a human reaching out to another. But for Arthur, it was an earthquake. His mind raced a handshake. With a guard, it was unheard of, a direct breach of protocol. It would mean acknowledgement, interaction, a break in the sacred stillness. Captain Davy's stern face flashed in his mind. The unyielding rules, the consequences. But then Arthur thought of the children, the pure, unbridled joy on the face of the boy who had received an autograph. He thought of the weary look he'd seen in Elvis's eyes in some newspaper photos, the loneliness that fame could bring. Thought of the quiet dignity Elvis carried despite the whirlwind around him, and in that fraction of a second the decision was made. It was a deeply personal one, driven not by celebrity worship, but by a powerful, unexpected surge of human empathy. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur began to move. It was a subtle shift, at first barely perceptible. His left hand, which held the butt of his rifle, did not move, but his right hand, the one that lay flat against his chest, began to rise. Every muscle in his body protested, unused to such deviation. His movements were precise, slow, almost agonizingly deliberate. He didn't break posture entirely, but merely adjusted enough to free his right hand. The crowd gasped a collective whisper of awe. Even Elvis's security personnel seemed momentarily stunned. Then Arthur extended his own hand. His white, gloved hand met Elvis's bare one. It was a firm grip. For a fleeting moment their hands were clasped, a bridge between two vastly different worlds. The king of rock and roll and the Queen's Guard, the flamboyant performer and the embodiment of rigid discipline. Elvis's smile widened, a genuine, heartfelt expression of delight. He squeezed Arthur's hand briefly, his eyes twinkling with warmth, and Arthur sensed a deep appreciation for the gesture. "Thank you," Elvis murmured, his voice a low, respectful tone only for Arthur to hear. "I truly appreciate what you do." Arthur, still unable to speak, felt a surge of emotion, pride, a quiet satisfaction. He met Elvis's gaze, and for the first time in his professional life, he allowed a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of a smile to grace his lips. It was barely there, a ghost of a smile, but it was real. And at that precise moment, from somewhere in the small, hushed crowd, a camera flashed. Not a casual tourist snapshot, but the deliberate click of a professional photographer's lens. It was a sound that would echo through history. The iconic photo was taken. Elvis, still holding Arthur's hand for another heartbeat, seemed to register the flash. His smile broadened further, a knowing look passing between them. Then gently he released Arthur's hand. Arthur's right hand returned to its rigid position, pressed flat against his chest. His face immediately resumed its stoic mask. His eyes' extraordinary moment was over. He was a statue again. Elvis gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Arthur, a silent salute to the guard's incredible gesture. He then turned to the astonished crowd, giving them a broad, beaming smile and a wave before turning and continuing his walk, his entourage quickly falling in behind him. The crowd, released from their spell, erupted, not in the frenzied screams of earlier, but in gasps of disbelief, exclamations of amazement, and excited chatter. "Did you see that?" He shook his hand. The guard moved. "I've never seen that." Arthur, however, was already back in his disciplined world. His heart still thudding, a strange warmth still lingering where Elvis's hand had met his. He had done it. He had broken protocol. For a handshake, for a smile, for a moment of human connection, the consequences would surely come. But in that moment he felt an undeniable sense of rightness, a quiet triumph. He had not just upheld his duty to the crown, he had also, perhaps, upheld a deeper duty. The duty of simple human kindness. The immediate aftermath of the handshake was a strange cocktail of exhilaration and dread for Arthur. The brief, extraordinary contact with Elvis's hand, the quiet exchange of respect still hummed in his palm, but the click of that camera, sharp and definitive, had sealed his fate. He knew with an icy certainty that the photograph would surface, and when it did, the consequences would be swift and severe. He completed the remainder of his shift in a state of heightened awareness, every nerve ending tingling. He maintained his perfect stillness, his unblinking gaze, but beneath the bearskin his mind raced. Would anyone have noticed? The crowd was small, but that photographer, he wasn't just a tourist with a snapshot camera. When his relief finally arrived, Arthur performed the exchange with his usual precision, saluting smartly before marching back to the barracks. He avoided eye contact with his fellow guards, afraid his face would betray the tremor in his soul. Later that evening, the storm broke. It began with whispers in the mess hall. Then a guardsman rushed in, holding up a newspaper, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Pringle, look at this." The front page was dominated by a large, grainy, but unmistakable photograph. There it was. Elvis Presley. His hand extended, his face alight with a smile. And there was Arthur Pringle, his bearskin hat perfectly straight, his scarlet tunic immaculate, but his right hand clearly extended, clasped firmly in Elvis's. And on Arthur's face, barely perceptible but undeniably, there was that ghost of a smile. The headline screamed, "King meets guard. Pro-Au broken. F-O-R-A." A hush fell over the mess hall, quickly followed by a flurry of astonished exclamations. George clapped Arthur on the back, a look of bewildered admiration on his face. "You did it, Arthur. You actually did it." But Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The photo was iconic. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Arthur was summoned, not to Captain Davy's office, but to the commanding officer's quarters, a chilling sign of the seriousness of the situation. The room was austere, the air thick with unspoken disapproval. Colonel Hastings, a man whose reputation for strict discipline preceded him, sat behind a large desk, his expression unreadable. Captain Davy stood rigidly beside him, his face a mask of disappointment. Guard Pringle, Colonel Hastings' voice was low, controlled, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Do you recognize this?" He pushed a copy of the newspaper across the desk. The iconic photo stared up at Arthur. "Yes, sir," Arthur said, his voice steady, betraying none of the fear churning inside him. "And you admit to being the individual in this photograph?" "Yes, sir." "You are aware, Guard Pringle, of the strict protocols governing the conduct of the Queen's Guard?" "Yes, sir." "You are aware that any form of interaction beyond the most basic and unavoidable is strictly forbidden while on duty?" "Yes, sir." Colonel Hastings leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Then perhaps, Guard Pringle, you might explain why you chose to violate those protocols in such a public and blatant manner." Arthur took a deep breath. He had prepared for this. He would not lie. He excuses. "Sirrard," he began, his voice clear and resonant. Mr. Presley extended his hand. He did so respectfully. He seemed genuinely interested in the dedication of the guards. "I felt, sir, that to refuse a simple human gesture of courtesy from a man who represents so much to so many would have been a greater dishonor." "It was a moment, sir, a brief human moment. I believed it was right." Silence descended upon the room. Colonel Hastings studied him, his expression still unreadable. Captain Davies shifted uncomfortably. "A human moment, Guard Pringle, comes at a high cost when one wears this uniform," Colonel Hastings finally said, his voice hardening slightly. "The dignity of the crown, the image of unwavering discipline, is paramount. Your actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, have created a precedent. The new Forsas wore at ease." Colonel Hastings leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips. "However," he continued, his gaze still fixed on Arthur, "I am also aware of the public reaction. The photograph has indeed gone round the world, and it seems the world rather likes it." Arthur blinked, surprised. "The palace has been inundated with messages," the colonel continued, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "From ordinary citizens, from dignitaries, even from overseas. They are not condemning you, Guard Pringle, quite the opposite. They see it as a moment of genuine humanity, a rare glimpse behind the stoic facade. Even Mr. Presley himself has made a public statement expressing his gratitude." Arthur felt a wave of dizzying relief, quickly followed by confusion. Colonel Hastings stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the palace grounds. "Your actions were a clear breach of protocol, Guard Pringle. There will be consequences. A formal reprimand will be assigned to less public duties for a period." But he turned back, his gaze. "Sposthenes. Candy unextrod Mac. Motherk, you displayed a moment of human judgment, Guard Pringle," Colonel Hastings concluded, his voice firm again. Arthur saluted his hand, shaking almost imperceptibly. He had survived, not unscathed, but not broken. The iconic photograph, the one that broke protocol, had also surprisingly saved him. The days following the infamous handshake and its publication were a strange blur for Arthur. The formal reprimand was delivered with military precision, a stern lecture from Captain Davies, a written note placed in his file, and reassignment to less visible duties. Instead of the main gates, he was now on night patrol in less frequented areas, or assisting with internal palace duties. He was, in essence, put in the sin bin, a visible example of consequences. Yet, despite the official punishment, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere around him. His fellow guards, who had initially been shocked, now regarded him with a mix of awe and quiet respect. George, in particular, was full of admiration. "You're a legend, Arthur," George whispered to him one evening as they cleaned their rifles. "A proper legend, they say. The photos everywhere. Even the Queen's apparently seen it." He paused, grinning, and I heard her ladyship had a bit of a chuckle about it. Arthur, still trying to process the roller coaster of events, could only manage a slight shrug. The reprimand was real. For less visible duties, a clear sign of his transgression. The unspoken approval, the subtle nods from other guards, the sheer volume of public goodwill. It was overwhelming. The newspapers continued to carry stories about the photo. The human guard, one headline dubbed him. Another declared it the most heartwarming moment of Elvis's London visit. Letters flooded into the palace, not condemning Arthur, but praising him for his humanity, his courage, his simple kindness. He learned that Elvis himself had been deeply touched. His publicist had released a statement, and Elvis had reportedly spoken about it in interviews before leaving London. That guard, Elvis had apparently said, "He's a true gentleman. He gave me a moment of genuine connection without saying a word." That's what real respect looks like. Hearing this, Arthur felt a profound sense of validation. It wasn't about the fame or the breaking of rules. It was about that connection, that moment of shared humanity that had transcended their vastly different stations. He reflected on his choice. It had been impulsive, yes, but also deeply considered. He had weighed duty against a different kind of duty, a duty to human connection, to acknowledging the quiet plea for warmth from a man who, despite all his adoration, seemed to crave genuine interaction. He had risked everything, and remarkably he had been met not with total condemnation but with a surprising degree of understanding. The incident forced Arthur to reevaluate his perception of duty. It wasn't just about the rigid adherence to rules, he realized. It was also about judgment, about understanding the spirit of the law, not just the letter. There were times, rare as they might be, when a greater good could be served by a slight deviation from the norm. It was a fine line, a dangerous path, but he had walked it and emerged, if not unscathed, then certainly changed. His new duties, while less glamorous, gave him time to think. He still performed with the same meticulous dedication, but his internal landscape had shifted. He was no longer just a stoic figure. He was a man who had made a choice, a human being who had dared to reach out across a divide. He saw the photo everywhere, on postcards, in souvenir shops, even briefly in a television news report. It had truly become iconic. It wasn't just a picture of a celebrity in a guard, it was a symbol of unexpected connection, of the power of a simple gesture of breaking down barriers, however briefly. One afternoon, while polishing boots in the quiet of his barrack room, he found himself humming. It wasn't a military march, nor a classical tune. It was a melody he had heard on the radio, a rock and roll tune, Elvis's tune. He smiled to himself. The king had left London, but he had left an indelible mark on Arthur Pringle the guard, who had dared to be human. The official consequences might have been a reprimand and a temporary demotion, but the unofficial ones were far more profound. Arthur felt a lightness, a sense of having truly lived a moment rather than just observed it. He had faced his deepest fears of professional failure and found unexpected grace. He had learned that sometimes the most rigid lines could be blurred, and in that blurring something beautiful and lasting could emerge. He had found a new understanding of his place in the world, not just as a guard, but as a person capable of making a difference one handshake at a time. Years passed. The iconic photograph of Elvis Presley shaking hands with the Buckingham Palace guard became more than just a newspaper clipping. It became a piece of cultural history. It was reprinted in books about Elvis, featured in documentaries about London, and graced countless souvenir shops as a testament to an unforgettable moment. It perfectly captured the clash and unexpected harmony between two worlds, the electrifying spontaneity of global celebrity and the unwavering tradition of British royalty. Arthur Pringle, though still a guard, carried the legacy of that moment quietly within him. His period of less public duties eventually ended, and he returned to his regular rotation, including occasional shifts at the main gates. He was still the embodiment of discipline and stoicism, his posture as perfect as ever, his bearskin hat as immaculately placed. But those who knew him, especially George, saw a subtle change, but deeper wisdom in his eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth that hadn't been there before. He was never officially lauded for his actions, and he never sought it. The reprimand remained in his file, a permanent mark of his transgression. But the quiet respect he earned from his peers, and the occasional knowing smile from a senior officer, spoke volumes. He had shown that humanity, even in the most rigid of environments, could sometimes triumph in a way that resonated with the world. Elvis Presley, the king, continued his reign, his music and charisma, touching millions more lives. He never forgot the guard who broke protocol for him. In later interviews, whenever the iconic photo was brought up, he spoke with genuine warmth about the moment, often remarking on Arthur's courage and heart. It was a testament to how deeply that simple handshake had resonated with the lonely superstar. Arthur never met Elvis again. Their paths, so briefly intertwined, diverged once more. The memory of that moment, the warmth of the handshake, the quiet exchange of respect, remained vivid for him. It was a reminder that behind every uniform, every public persona, lay a human being. Over the decades, Arthur Pringle rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a sergeant himself. He was known as a fair but firm leader. He was a stickler for protocol, often quoting Captain Davies' admonitions, yet occasionally when a new recruit asked about the famous photo, or when he saw a tourist struggling with a child, he would offer a quiet piece of advice. "Duty is paramount, lads," he'd say, polishing his boots. "But remember, we serve the people." And sometimes, a quiet moment of understanding, a simple acknowledgement, can speak louder than any rule. He would never explicitly mention his own breach, but the message was clear. The photo continued to live on. It appeared in museums, in historical exhibitions, in art galleries. It became a symbol of the unexpected, the heartwarming, the moment when two disparate worlds touched and created magic. People would look at it and wonder about the story behind it, about the guard who dared to be human. Arthur eventually retired from the guards, a respected veteran. He bought that small cottage in Kent he dreamt of with a garden, and spent his days tending to roses. He kept the framed newspaper clipping of the handshake tucked away in a drawer. A private treasure. He didn't show it often, but sometimes on a quiet evening he would take it out and reflect. He had dedicated his life to duty, to serving the crown, to upholding tradition. But in that one fleeting moment, he had also served humanity. He had reached out, connected, and in doing so created something truly enduring. He had learned that while rules were essential for order, it was the spirit of compassion and connection that truly made life, and indeed duty, meaningful. The Buckingham Palace Guard and Elvis Presley. The iconic photo lived on, a silent testament to a single heartwarming handshake that transcended fame, protocol, and expectation, and quietly, profoundly changed the lives of those involved, leaving an indelible mark on history.